Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Starr here with you guys. Today, we are going to be looking at the two different forces during World War II. We're going to be looking at the Axis powers and the Allied powers. All right, so the big two icon statements here today. We're looking at being able to describe the turning points in World War II in Europe, specifically Stalingrad and El Alamein. We're also going to be looking at some of the other major events as well. So things like D-Day or the Battle of the Bulge, Soviets conquering Berlin, and then the Soviet and American split of Europe as well. So we'll be getting into some of the basic ideas of some of the battles that kind of lead towards the end, the turning points. All right. Before we do that, let's go ahead and get started here. We're looking first at the Axis leaders here. Three major countries, three major leaders. Hopefully you recognize at least one or two of them here. But we have Adolf Hitler, obviously the premier of Germany. We have Tojo, who is the military leader of Japan. And then we have Mussolini, who was the leader of Italy. That makes up your Axis powers, your Axis leaders right there. Now, on the other side, we have our Allied leaders, and this is them meeting at one of two conferences that they actually met at together to kind of plan strategy for the war and then also plan post-war strategy as well. So we have Franklin Delano Roosevelt from the United States. We have Winston Churchill from Great Britain, and we have Joseph Stalin from the Soviet Union. All right, again, those three countries that worked together as the Allied powers. Now, each side, the Axis and the Allies, both had advantages that the other side didn't have. All right, so let's take a look at the advantages for the Axis powers and the advantages for the Allied powers. Axis power advantages were a couple of major ones. All right, number one, within advantages, they used, specifically Germany, used the blitzkrieg style of warfare. This blitzkrieg is actually a term that was made up by the American forces, but the idea was that they hit very hard, very quickly. They would take all their artillery, all their aircraft, all their weapons, and they would basically overwhelm a country as fast as possible so that they could then come in with their infantry and kind of take control of that country. And so they used this lightning warfare, this blitzkrieg, all across Europe, specifically taking out some of the lesser or weaker countries first. All right, so again, we're using the armored tanks, we're using the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, as they called them, to take out these areas. They would come in, they would attack quickly, they would conquer that area quickly, and then move on to the next country. All right. The other big advantages the Axis powers have is that they are the first to attack. They are the first ones to make these strikes here, specifically Germany here and also Japan too. They are the first ones to come in. They attack those weaker nations right off the bat. Now, what are the things that they need? So those are the advantages, but what are the things that the Axis powers are looking for and trying to accomplish and get? Well, there's a couple big ones. All right. Number one is Germany is looking for territory. They're looking to expand the size of their country. They want room to be able to spread out, essentially, and grab more and more territory to expand their empire, basically. They also need something to enable them to be able to do this, and that's resources. Specifically, they need oil. And Japan has this same issue too. To enable them to continue to expand their land and territory, they also need oil. And so it became the Allies' advantage to stop the Germans and the Japanese from getting to the oil that they needed in order to continue the war. That became kind of the top priority here. When we look at the Allied powers, again, a couple of advantages that they had. Number one was technology. They had new technology that the Axis powers did not to begin with. They had radar, so they could actually see when the Axis powers were attacking. So they were able to kind of prepare and make sure that they could help to defend themselves. They eventually would also use the scientific discovery of the atomic bomb. Right, the United States discovers and creates the atomic bomb, which ultimately will be used in Japan. And we'll talk about that later on here. Another big advantage they had is they were a greater industrial power. They had the ability to ramp up production and make things faster and produce more so they could continue the war effort. So they increased the production. They produced massive amounts of weapons and tanks and aircraft and artillery and all these things they needed in order to continue the war. And the other big advantage was for the Allied powers is they had all the resources they needed. They didn't have to, they didn't have to worry about oil. That's the big one, right? So the United States, Great Britain, they had an abundant supply of the oil they needed to power this war machine, right? Again, that's why this becomes kind of the focus of them trying to stop Japan, stop Germany from getting to the oil reserves that they needed to continue the war as well. So a couple other things that go along with this, when we look at the French, we haven't talked a lot about the French. They were part of the Allied powers, but they get overwhelmed pretty quickly at the beginning of the war here by the Germans. This right here, the Maginot Line, was kind of the answer that the French believed would help stop German invasions. And so basically what it was along the border. So you can see that picture on the right. It's kind of a cutaway of the underground bunkers that they created. And then they've got kind of those bubbles on the top of the ground that were part of the this bunker. They created this line of bunkers across the German-French border that they believed was going to stop the Germans from coming across the border. The problem that they didn't anticipate was that when they finally do actually use these massive trenches, these kind of underground concrete structures that they created, they didn't allow for the ability to turn their guns around. So the only way they could fire was basically straight towards Germany. The problem was when technology advances at this point, the Germans just flew with their aircraft right over the top. They dropped their soldiers on the other side of the Maginot Line, and there was nothing the Maginot Line could do. So it was essentially useless when it came down to it. But they had these large fortifications. They had a number of these rail guns as well. The Germans had used some of these rail guns prior to this too. But essentially, they're using outdated technology. Right, the French are. And so one of the reasons why they're overwhelmed so quickly is because they didn't keep up with the latest war techniques, war strategies, war technology at this time. There is a picture of the Maginot Line, and again, there are some of these structures still there. Most of the structure is still there underground, but you can still go and visit some of these structures in France today. Again, they really didn't get a whole lot of use because the Germans kind of just flew over the top, didn't have to worry about it. So there was not really a ground assault that went right at this fortification. Kind of the last thing we need to look at, guys, is a couple of the major battles that became basically turning points in the war. All right. So when we look at some of these major battles, we're going to start off looking at and talking about the significance of them. All right. So the first battle we're going to look at is the Battle of Dunkirk. That's the picture on the right up there. And actually, there was a movie made recently about the Battle of Dunkirk. Basically, what happened was the British and Belgian forces here and some of the French forces were basically in retreat. They are retreating to get off of the continent. They were trying to get back over to Britain so they would be saved. So about 560,000 of those troops were on the beaches of Dunkirk. And Hitler, this is kind of Hitler's first mistake he makes in the war. And that is he waits just too long to issue the attack orders, and all of those troops end up being, the majority of those troops, I should say, end up being rescued by some of them by the British Navy. Some of them literally just by people that were in Britain that decided they needed to go and rescue the soldiers. And so 560,000 of those troops are rescued from basically a slaughter, right? Or Hitler basically all he had to do was make the order, and basically all those Allied soldiers would have been destroyed or killed. So what this allows them to do is eventually those 560,000 people who are rescued, they go back to Britain, and now they can work on becoming part of the invasion force later on. They're able to go back into the war. And that's why I say this actually was kind of Hitler's first major mistake of the war at this point. All right, not capturing or not killing the people there or ordering the attack in time anyway at Dunkirk. So Dunkirk saves a number of Allied soldiers' lives. The next major turning point we have is the Battle of El Alamein, and this is in northern Africa. All right, so Germany, like we said, has needed oil, and they decide that they are going to head down to the Middle East, and they are going to go across northern Africa to get to the oil reserves in the Middle East. So the United States, and this is at the point where the U.S. is getting involved now, and Britain has decided that they need to stop General Rommel, who is the German general who was put in charge down in northern Africa, from getting to the oil reserves. Because if Germany gets those oil reserves, they will be able to basically continue this war indefinitely. And so the British and the Americans set up kind of defensive patterns here to stop the Germans from reaching all the way to the Suez Canal, and they're able to do it. All right, they are successful, and basically this is a tank battle out in the desert. So you have the famous German general Erwin Rommel versus Montgomery and Patton in northern Africa, and so those two are able to stop the German advance, and they're able to save not only the Suez Canal but also the oil reserves in that area. All right, they keep the oil from Germany. Another major European battle that becomes a turning point is the Battle of Britain. All right, the Battle of Britain is known as Hitler launches this attack. It's known as Operation Sea Lion, and the idea was to kind of demoralize and hopefully defeat Britain. Now, it basically they continually bomb London and bomb parts of Britain from Germany, from France at this point, that they're able to come in and continue this attack. Basically, they're on the brink of utter defeat. And quite frankly, if Britain loses to Germany at this point, most likely history has changed. America would not be able to get involved in the war at that point. There would be no place to stage an invasion from that would actually be viable for helping to liberate the rest of Europe. And so Britain is the last stronghold of the Allied forces at this point. And the Royal Air Force eventually saves the city of London and eventually saves and stops the Battle of Britain here, this aerial assault that was being done by the Germans. And so they're able to stop this from happening and essentially stop Germany from invading Britain. And so this is actually Hitler's very first defeat in World War II. And we're going to see that this is kind of one of those big turning points. All right. He is defeated by the British. The Americans will get involved shortly after. And between the Americans and the British, they're able to launch an offensive, which we'll talk about later, on the Western Front. All right. The turning point in the East for World War II and for Europe is this one right here, is the city of Stalingrad. And so when we look at the Battle of Stalingrad, essentially what happens here is Hitler attacks the Soviet forces. And Russia or the Soviet Union is a very large country. And so he attacks the Soviet forces and he's making his way into the country. In fact, he's gone 200-300 miles into the country and Germany has seen success until winter hits. And those of you who remember back to Napoleon, the same thing happened to Napoleon Bonaparte when he was attacking Russia. He found a lot of success. They kind of pulled back and pulled back and pulled back until winter hit. And then they weren't able to continue. And that's exactly what we see here too, is the German forces aren't able to continue in the harsh winter storms that hit at that point. There was no actual reason for them to attack Stalingrad. They decided to attack it kind of out of ego. Hitler decided he wanted to take the city that was named after the Soviet leader. And so they went after Stalingrad, and that's essentially where the Soviets stop Hitler's advance. And from that point forward, after the Soviets win in Stalingrad, they start to march the Germans back out of the country and back towards Germany at that point. All right, so the Eastern Front is starting to push back. The Soviets are starting to win. And on the other front, the Western Front, the British and the Americans open up the Western Front with a major battle called D-Day, the Battle of Normandy. All right, so when we look at the Battle of Normandy here on D-Day, the Allied forces mount the largest invasion in history. All right, and they come in. The 101st Airborne for the United States is dropped behind enemy lines the night before. They're supposed to disrupt the enemy lines, and they're supposed to basically control the bridges in the area. And then the next day, they storm the beaches. The United States and Great Britain storm the beaches. Lots and lots of people die in this invasion. But this accomplishes what the Soviets had been asking for a long time, and that is it opens up the Western Front. It opens up a second front against Germany. So now Germany is facing attack on the western side in France, and they're facing attack on the eastern side as the Soviets push them out of the Soviet Union and back into Poland. All right, and so the idea is to, on each side, continue to work them back towards Germany and essentially squeeze them back and destroy them at that point. All right, so that kind of wraps up, guys, our Axis and allies. We'll get a little bit more into it here as we keep going. So if you have any questions, as always, make sure you contact your teacher. Have a good one.